-80 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not weather. That's a verdict. 93 years old. No road. No telephone line. No one close enough to hear me if I called out. If you've ever stepped into -20, you know it stings. At -40, metal takes skin. At -60, breath thickens before it leaves your mouth. But -80? That's where the line between living and dying gets thin enough to see through. My name is Lillian Hart. In January of 1971, I was alone in a cabin north of Fairbanks, built by my husband with lumber hauled by hand in faith we'd never need to depend on anyone else. By then, Henry had been gone 12 winters. My son Daniel worked pipeline miles away. When he left that last time, he stood in my doorway longer than usual. That should have told me something. The morning the cold settled in, the air went still. Not windy. Not storming. Still. I stepped outside before sunrise and the snow under my boots didn't crunch, it cracked. Sharp. Brittle. Like stepping on broken glass. Inside, the water bucket had frozen halfway through. That had never happened this early in the day. I chipped at the ice with a spoon and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Doubt. The radio confirmed what the ice already knew. Arctic high pressure over the interior. Temperatures falling rapidly. Exposure deadly in minutes. Deadly in minutes. I've buried a husband. I've opened telegrams that began with "We regret to inform you." I don't scare easily. But I respected numbers. And these numbers were wrong. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, pressing my palm to each seam Henry had sealed decades ago. Would contracts in this kind of cold? Nails shift. Gaps appear where there were none. Back inside, I opened my ledger. Beans. Flour. Salt pork. Coffee. 3 days at full heat. Maybe 5 if I cut back hard. If the stove went out in the night, I would not wake up. That is not drama. That is physics. I stood in the center of the cabin and listened. The walls made a long, low groan as the temperature dropped again. Timber tightening. The world squeezing smaller. Now listen carefully. This was the decision. I could leave. The maintenance camp was miles downriver. If I started immediately, before it dropped further, I might reach shelter before dark. Or I could stay. Trust Henry's stove. Trust the woodpile. Trust that Daniel would fight through when the roads opened. One choice meant movement and risk. The other meant waiting and faith. I opened the door halfway. The cold did not rush in. It pressed. Slow. Heavy. Like a hand on my chest. I stepped one boot into the snow. It swallowed me to the shin. My breath caught sharp in my lungs. For a second, just a second, my balance wavered. And I saw it. Not in imagination. In clarity. Falling. Snow filling my collar. Hands too numb to push up. No one finding me until spring. My heart pounded harder than it had in years. For the first time in a very long life, I felt small. Not old. Small. The thermometer outside the window read -54. Still dropping. If I waited much longer, walking wouldn't even be an option. I closed my eyes and whispered something I hadn't admitted out loud before. I don't know if I can do this.
If you faced a hard winter, you know pride can kill you. Would you walk or would you stay? What you doing, man?
That was the truth. Not stubbornness. Not pride. Fear. You ever notice how silence can get louder than wind? That's what woke me. Not a storm. Not a branch hitting the roof. Just a pressure in the air so heavy it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. I opened my eyes in the dark and knew something had changed. The stove had gone low. Not dead yet, but low enough that the cold was moving again, creeping along the floorboards, climbing chair legs, settling into the blanket over my knees. I pushed myself upright slow. At 93, you don't spring out of a chair. You negotiate with it. My joints argued. My back protested. But the cold doesn't wait for comfort. When my feet touched the floor, it felt like stepping into river water. Inside the cabin. That's when you understand, the outside has found its way in. I fed the stove carefully. Not generous. Careful. 2 logs. Not 3. Kindling saved for later. I watched the flame catch, thin at first, then steadier. Fire isn't just heat out here. It's company. I checked the water bucket. Frozen solid. Yesterday it still had a skin. Now it was stone. I set it near the stove and told myself that was fine. Ice is still water. You just have to be patient. The radio sat on the shelf where I left it. I turned the dial. Static. I adjusted the antenna. More static. Sometimes in deep cold, batteries lose their nerve. They forget their purpose. I tapped the side once, twice. Nothing. Now that silence felt different. When you live far from town, voices matter. Even strangers. Especially strangers. I stood there a long moment holding the radio in my hands. It felt lighter than I remembered. I set it down gently. All right, I said to no one. Then it's just us. I dressed in layers. Wool first. Then Henry's flannel. Then Daniel's old coat that still smelled faintly of oil and outside air. Mittens inside gloves. Scarf tight. Breathing hurt more today. Not sharp, just heavy. Each inhale felt thicker, as if the air had weight to it. I walked to the window and scraped away frost with the edge of a spoon. The trees weren't moving. That worried me more than wind ever did. Still air means the cold settles. It doesn't pass through. It sits down and stays. I did my ration math again. Half portions now. No warm meals unless the stove was already burning for heat. No extra fire for comfort. Comfort was expensive. I melted a cup of water and sipped it slow. Steam against my face felt like a blessing. You learn something after living long enough. Hunger doesn't scare you. Loneliness doesn't scare you. But wasting what little you have, that will keep you awake at night. Around midday, I noticed something small. The inside wall near the window had a faint white line crawling across it. Frost. Inside the cabin. That meant the wood was losing ground. I pressed my palm there and felt the cold pushing through. Not a draft. A presence. I fetched Henry's hammer again and checked the frame. The wood was shrinking. A thin split had widened since yesterday. I packed it tight with cloth and wax, working slow, fingers already stiff. For a moment, my hands wouldn't close properly around the hammer. That frightened me. Not the crack. My hands. I rubbed them hard until the feeling came back, scolding myself under my breath. You're not done yet. The hours passed strange. Without radio, without wind, there was no measure. Just light shifting behind frost-covered glass. At some point I realized something else. I hadn't heard an airplane.
No engines, no wind. That no peace. That isolations. Can you still alive?
In winter you sometimes catch the faint engine sound high overhead. Supply runs. Survey flights. Nothing today. Just the stove ticking and the cabin settling. I sat down and felt the tiredness arrive heavy. Not sleepiness. A deeper kind. The kind that says, you've lived a full life. It would be all right to rest. That thought is dangerous in extreme cold. Rest can turn permanent. I leaned forward in the chair and slapped my own knee hard. Stay awake, I told myself. I stood up again even though sitting felt better. I swept the floor. I reorganized the woodpile for the third time. I counted the matches again. Keeping the mind moving keeps the body moving. Late afternoon, though I only guessed it by the fading light, I opened the door just an inch to look outside. The cold hit like a wall. It didn't burn anymore. It numbed instantly. That is worse. I shut the door quickly, lungs tight. The thermometer hung just beyond the frame. I couldn't see the number clearly through the frost. But I didn't need to. I could feel it in my knees. In my lungs. In the way the cabin no longer groaned, it creaked sharp and quick now, like small bones snapping. Evening settled. I lit the lamp early to save myself from thinking about the dark. I ate 3 spoonfuls of beans. That was supper. Hunger is manageable. Regret is not. As I sat there, I imagined Daniel trying to get back. Roads closed. Engines refusing to start. Men cursing frozen fuel lines. I didn't want him driving in this. That was the strange comfort. If he couldn't come, at least he wasn't risking his life on my account. I moved closer to the stove and stretched my hands toward it. The heat felt thinner tonight. The wood pile looked smaller. I measured the space between logs with my eyes and calculated days. 2 if I was careful. Maybe 3. If the cold didn't deepen further. And that was the thought I refused to finish. The lamp flickered once. Just once. I stared at it longer than necessary. You start noticing everything when survival narrows down to details. Outside, the sky turned that deep metallic blue that only comes with severe cold. No clouds. No movement. Just a world locked tight. I leaned back slowly in my chair, layers stiff around my shoulders, and listened. No radio. No wind. No engines in the distance. Just the faint, steady crackle of the stove. And underneath it, a new sound. A faint, dry ticking inside the wall. Wood shrinking further. The cabin adjusting to something even colder. I closed my eyes for a second, just one, and felt how tired my bones were. Then I opened them again. Because I understood something clearly now. This wasn't the worst of it. This was only the beginning. I didn't mark that day on any calendar. Out here, the cold doesn't care what date it is. But I remember the moment it truly began, when my eyelashes stuck together after a blink, and I had to peel them apart like wet paper. You're probably warm right now. Maybe you've got a heater humming, maybe a dog at your feet. Hold on to that thought, because in my cabin that night, warmth became something you chased and never quite caught. The stove was still alive, but it sounded different. Not the friendly crackle I'd known for years. More like a thin, tired breathing. I knelt in front of it and watched the fire shrink, as if the cold outside was pulling it away through the pipe. I'd already cut my meals down to almost nothing. A few spoonfuls of beans. A sip of melted snow. Coffee only in my memory. And still the woodpile kept getting smaller, like someone was stealing from me while I slept. When you're 93, you know your body's limits. The truth is, your body is always negotiating. Give me 1 more hour, you tell it. Give me 1 more log's worth of heat. That night my body answered with a warning. My fingers wouldn't curl around the poker the way they should. I flexed them hard, trying to wake them up. The pain came late, dull and deep, like it had to travel through layers of numbness to reach me. That's when a thought I hated showed up in my mind. What if this is the night I stop fighting? I sat back in Henry's old chair. The lamp threw a small circle of light, and beyond it the cabin looked like a cave. Frost had crept across the inside corners. The window was a white sheet. Even the air seemed to glitter with cold. I looked at Henry's hammer on the table. I could almost hear him, calm as always. Lil, don't waste motion. Don't waste heat. Think first. And then came the choice, the kind men understand, the kind you don't brag about because it's too close to fear. Do I burn what's left of the cabin to save myself, or do I save the cabin and risk not seeing warning? I stood and walked to the back room where Henry kept his tools. My steps were slow, careful. Moving too fast made my chest hurt. The boards complained under my weight, sharp little squeaks that felt louder than they should. In the corner was the rocking chair Daniel built in high school, crooked but sturdy. I hadn't sat in it for years. It was a piece of my family, plain and honest. My hand hovered over it. You might think that sounds dramatic, burning a chair. But when you've lived long enough, you learn objects hold people. You burn the chair, you burn a little piece of the hands that made it. I whispered, I'm sorry. Then I tipped it over and took it apart. The first time the chair leg caught in the stove, the flame jumped like it was hungry. Heat pushed into the room, brief and sharp, and I felt my skin wake up. I leaned close, palms open, and for a second I could pretend I was safe. But safety out there is always temporary. Around midnight, only guessing by the heaviness in my eyes, the stove sputtered. The draft changed. The fire bent sideways like it was trying to escape. A faint smell of smoke curled into the room. My heart kicked. If the chimney iced over, the stove would choke. If it choked, the fire would die. If it died, you already know. I pulled on my coat and opened the door just enough to slip outside. The cold hit me so hard it stole my breath. The night was perfectly clear, stars sharp as nails. The air felt solid, like you could break it. I reached the stovepipe with my mittened hand and felt it shivering with heat trying to leave, trapped by cold. I tapped the pipe gently. Ice flakes fell. Not enough. My mittens slipped. Bare skin touched metal for half a second, and pain exploded so bright it made me see white. I yanked back and bit my lips so hard I tasted blood. You think you know pain. You don't, not until cold teaches you its language. Back inside, I held my hand near the flame and forced myself to breathe slow. Panic wastes heat. Panic makes mistakes. Henry had taught me that without ever saying the words. The radio, useless for days, sat silent on the shelf. I stared at it anyway, like it might speak out of mercy. The thermometer was outside. I couldn't read it through the frost, but the cabin was telling me the number with every crack and pop. Wood shrinking. Glass tightening. The world contracting. I fed the stove with the last good pieces of split spruce. Then I looked at what remained: scraps, old boards, broken chair parts, a small stack of kindling I'd been saving like gold. I sat down and spoke to you, even though you weren't there. This is where people die. Not with a scream. With a soft decision. With their eyes closing just for a minute. I forced my eyes open and stood again. I wrapped myself in every blanket I owned and tied a scarf across my mouth. I set my boots right beside the stove so I could move fast if I had to. I placed matches and kindling within reach of my hand, like a soldier laying out ammunition. Then the flame dipped. Once. Twice. The cabin's light thinned. I leaned forward, heart pounding, and listened to the stove like it was a living thing. Come on, I thought. Come on. Outside, in the silence, something snapped, wood in the trees, or maybe wood in my own walls. Hard to tell anymore. I didn't pray for a miracle. I prayed for one more hour. And the fire answered with a small, stubborn flare, but it was weaker than before. That's when I understood the cold was still winning. And the longest night of my life wasn't over yet. Morning didn't arrive like it should. It crept in, pale and cautious, as if the sun itself was afraid to look at what had happened overnight. The light that filtered through my frosted window wasn't gold. It was the color of tin. I was still in Henry's chair, wrapped in every blanket I owned, boots on, scarf tied across my mouth. I'd slept in pieces, minutes at a time, waking every time the stove changed its breathing. Every time the cabin popped or groaned like an old man turning in bed. The first thing I did was listen. No wind. No radio. No engine. Just a thin, lonely crackle from the stove that told me one thing: I was still here. I pushed myself forward and nearly fell. My legs didn't want to remember they were legs. My hands were swollen and clumsy, as if they belonged to someone else. When I tried to unbutton my coat, my fingers fumbled like a child's. That scared me more than the cold. Because cold is an enemy you can see. But a body that stops obeying? That feels like betrayal. I fed the stove the last decent pieces of wood, small ones, because I didn't have big ones anymore. The flame caught, weak and thin, and I stared at it like a man watches a heartbeat monitor. Then I checked the bucket by the stove. A little water had formed at the bottom. Not much. But enough to sip. I bent close and drank like it was medicine. You'd think victory would feel loud, but it didn't. It felt quiet. It felt like making it to the next fence post in a blizzard, only to realize there's still another mile. The cabin smelled like smoke and wax and old wool. The air was dry enough to crack your lips when you breathed. I touched my cheek and felt rough skin. I didn't need a mirror to know what I looked like. A survivor doesn't always look heroic. Sometimes she just looks used up. The hours that followed were the strangest part. Not the night. The after. When the worst danger passes, that's when your mind tries to collect what it almost lost. I scraped frost away from the window with the back of a knife. The glass protested. I cleared a little circle and looked out. The world was frozen solid. Trees stood rigid, branches coated in white. The river looked like iron. The air shimmered as if the cold was bending light itself. No tracks. No birds. No movement. It was beautiful in the way a graveyard can be beautiful, quiet and perfect and not meant for company. I told myself I would not go outside. Not today. Not unless I had to. One fall could end everything now, after I'd come this far. So I did what old people learn to do. I made my world small. I moved the chair closer to the stove. I kept my hands in my lap to save heat. I took tiny sips of water. I ate one bite of salt pork and forced myself to chew slowly so my stomach wouldn't rebel. And I waited. That waiting is the part people don't talk about. Not the dramatic night. The waiting. Because waiting gives your mind room to fill with thoughts you don't invite. I thought of Henry's hands, scarred and steady, turning boards into walls. I thought of Daniel at 10 years old, proud as anything, hauling kindling like he was providing for an army. I thought of all the winters I'd survived with them beside me, and how easy it was to believe you'll always have someone. Then I remembered the moment I said, I don't know if I can do this. I felt ashamed of it for half a heartbeat. Then I let the shame go. Because fear doesn't make you weak. Quitting does. By afternoon the cabin started making different sounds. Not the sharp, scared creaks of contracting wood. Softer ones. Like the place was exhaling. The cold was still there, but something had shifted. The air didn't feel quite as heavy. I didn't trust it. Alaska teaches you not to trust mercy. And then, late, when the light outside had that slanted, tired look, I heard something that didn't belong to the wilderness. A distant engine. At first I thought it was my imagination. Cold plays tricks. Isolation plays worse ones. But it came again. Closer. A steady mechanical growl, muffled by snow. My throat tightened so fast I almost couldn't breathe. I stood too quickly and pain shot through my knees. I grabbed the table to steady myself and listen like my life depended on it. Because it did. The sound stopped. Silence. Then a knock. Not loud. Careful. As if whoever was outside was afraid to break something fragile. For a second, I couldn't move. 93 years old, and I was suddenly a young bride again, waiting at a door, heart shaking, not sure what's on the other side. The knock came again. Ma? Daniel's voice. Not strong. Not cheerful. Rough with cold and worry. I opened the door and the air rushed in like a knife. But behind it was my son, bundled to the eyes, frost on his lashes, his face carved tight with fear. He looked at me like he was seeing a ghost. Jesus. Ma. I wanted to tell him I was fine. I wanted to sound like myself. But my voice came out small. I didn't burn the cabin, I said. That was the first thing I said to my son after days alone. Not I missed you. Not thank God. Just the truth of what I'd done. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me, careful at first, then tighter, like he was trying to put me back together. I felt his shoulders shaking. A grown man crying into his mother's blanket. And that, more than the cold, broke me. I held him and listened to his breathing until it slowed. Then I leaned back enough to see his face. He stared past me at the stove, at the broken chair pieces, at the wax-stuffed window frame. You stayed, he said. I nodded. I didn't want to die out there, I told him. And I didn't want you dying trying to reach me. He swallowed hard. Men don't like admitting how close they came to losing control. We couldn't get through, he said. Engines wouldn't turn. Fuel gelled. They said it was the coldest they'd ever seen. I didn't correct him. I didn't need the record. I had lived the number. He helped me sit. He made me drink warm broth from a thermos. He checked my hands, my feet, my face, like he was counting me to make sure all my pieces were still attached. Outside, the sky was clearing into a softer blue. The world was still frozen, but it didn't feel like a verdict anymore. It felt like a warning that had passed. Daniel looked around the cabin, eyes lingering on Henry's hammer on the table. "You did good," he said quietly. I looked at the stove, at the thin flame still fighting, and then I looked at my son. "I did what your father taught me," I said. "I didn't waste anything. Not wood. Not food. Not time." Daniel nodded, wiping his face with his sleeve like a boy. And in that moment, with the cold finally easing its grip, I understood something I wish I'd learned younger. Being alone isn't the same as being finished. Sometimes you survive long enough to hear a knock,